Let me ask you something. What if the most patriotic thing you ever did with your life savings turned out to be the worst financial decision of your life? Not because you were careless, not because you were greedy, but because you trusted the most powerful institution in the world, and it quietly took value from you. What I'm about to tell you isn't a theory. It's not an internet story. It's history. And it matters right now more than you think. Washington, D.C. April 28, 1941. The president signs the first war savings bond. He pays $21. In 10 years, he'll get 20 back. Simple. Clear. Safe. The next day, it's everywhere. Newspapers. Radio. Posters across the country. This is the most patriotic thing you can do. And people believed it. Over the next 4 years, 82 million Americans bought in. Together, they invested $192 billion. That wasn't spare money. That was wages. That was savings. That was sacrifice. A factory worker putting something aside every week. A grandmother saving quietly at home. A father thinking about his child's future. These weren't investors. These were ordinary people doing what they thought was right. They trusted their country. And 10 years later, the government kept its promise. It paid the $20. On time. In full. But there was one problem. That $20 could now only buy what $17 used to buy. The people who did everything right lost. Not in a crash. Not in a failure. In a policy. A real, documented policy that was designed that way. And the worst part? Nobody told them. Nobody warned them. The people behind it knew exactly what would happen. And it went ahead anyway. This story didn't end there. Because 1 year later, something changed that made everything worse. In 1942, the government needed to fund the war. That meant selling massive amounts of bonds. So they made a decision. They kept interest rates artificially low. No matter what happened. And the Federal Reserve agreed. From that point on, rates were capped. Short-term, long-term, everything controlled. If inflation rose, it didn't matter. The system would print money, buy bonds, and keep rates down. Quietly. No public debate. No warning. And it stayed like that for years. Which meant one thing. The people holding those bonds were stuck. No matter how expensive life became. Their returns could not rise. And then, everything finally hit. In July 1946, the system finally cracked open. Prices didn't rise slowly. They jumped. In a single month, inflation surged. Food prices spiked even higher. And within a year, the cost of living in the United States had climbed at a pace not seen since the Civil War. By 1947, prices were up nearly 19%. Now think about what that actually means. Not in numbers. In life. A factory worker in Cleveland had spent years buying government bonds. Week after week, paycheck after paycheck. He held them through the war. Through uncertainty. Through sacrifice. He did everything right. And in just 12 months, nearly 1/5 of the value he had saved was gone. Not stolen. Not lost in a crash. Just quietly erased by rising prices. Meanwhile, the system that created those bonds kept operating exactly as designed. The Federal Reserve continued supporting the Treasury. Interest rates stayed capped. Money kept flowing into the system to hold everything in place. And the same institution meant to protect the value of the currency also became part of the force reducing it. Senior Federal Reserve officials later described what was happening in front of Congress. They didn't soften it. They said the policy had turned the Federal Reserve into an engine of inflation. Those weren't critics speaking. That was the system reflecting on itself after the fact. And they had seen it all. The money creation. The rising prices. the growing gap between what people earned and what their savings could actually buy. But the structure didn't change overnight. Because by then, it wasn't just policy. It was coordination between institutions trying to manage debt, war costs, and economic pressure all at once. And when systems reach that point, decisions stop being simple. They become necessary inside the logic of the system itself. The officials involved were eventually replaced or moved into other roles. Not erased. Not silenced. Just shifted within the system. But the mechanism continued. Because the problem was no longer individual people. It was structural. And that structure had already shown something important. When government debt becomes too large, and financing it becomes too expensive, the system looks for ways to control the cost of money itself. Not by changing the debt, but by changing the value of the currency that debt is measured in. And history shows what that usually leads to. Not immediately, not loudly, but gradually, through pressure. And then faster than most people expect. By the time the next major shift came, the system was already under pressure again. Not from one event, but from accumulation. Debt, war costs, recovery spending, and a central bank still trying to balance stability with government financing. And once again, the same question returned. How do you fund large government debt without pushing borrowing costs too high? The answer has rarely changed. You control the cost of money. Quietly. Through policy coordination between institutions. And this is not new. It has been done before. But the effects do not appear immediately. They build underneath the surface. Because when interest rates are kept artificially low, and money supply expands to support government borrowing, the impact shows up somewhere else. In prices. In savings. In what money can actually buy. And by the time people notice it, the system is already in motion. This is what economists later called financial repression. A system where your money may still show the same number on paper, but it buys less in the real world. Slowly. Without a formal default ever being declared. And the historical pattern is consistent. Once a government uses this method successfully, it often becomes a recurring policy tool. Not as an emergency measure, but as a practical way to manage debt over time. And in every major case where this happened, the outcome followed a similar path. Long-term interest rates stayed below inflation for extended periods. Savers in fixed-income assets saw their real returns shrink. And people holding real assets, property, businesses, productive ownership, tended to hold or increase their wealth in comparison. Not because the system was designed to reward them, but because inflation does not affect all forms of wealth equally. It weakens fixed returns and shifts value toward ownership of real things. That is the core mechanism. Not a crash. Not a collapse. Just redistribution over time. And once that process begins, it is difficult to reverse without major economic trade-offs. Higher rates. Slower growth. Rising unemployment. All of which carry political and social costs. So instead, systems tend to adjust gradually. Managing pressure rather than resetting it. Absorbing imbalance rather than correcting it. And that is what makes it difficult to recognize in real time. Because nothing looks broken until you compare what money used to do before and what it can do now. Or more simply, everything looks normal until you realize the value never disappeared. It just moved. Now the question becomes, why does this matter today? Because these patterns don't disappear. They evolve. Different time. Different systems. Same pressure points. Let's bring it back to the present. The United States now carries a national debt measured in tens of trillions. Annual interest payments have become one of the largest expenses in the entire federal budget. And they are still rising. Not gradually anymore, but quickly. At this scale, the problem stops being theoretical. It becomes arithmetic. Because when debt grows this large, and interest costs grow with it, the system eventually tends to face a limited set of options. Raise taxes significantly, cut spending sharply, or adjust the cost of money itself. Historically, that option is often the one that tends to be used. Not because it is declared as an official strategy, but because it emerges through coordination between fiscal pressure and monetary policy. And once that happens, the effects begin to show up in familiar places. Interest rates struggle to stay above inflation for long periods. Savings lose purchasing power even when balances appear stable. And real assets begin to matter more than fixed returns. This is not a prediction of collapse. It is a description of pressure. And pressure moves through systems in predictable ways. Slowly at first. Then unevenly. And eventually, visibly. That is why markets often react before explanations arrive. They don't wait for confirmation. They respond to conditions. And in recent years, the same conditions have started to reappear. Rising debt levels, higher interest costs, persistent inflation cycles, and expanding government spending commitments across multiple sectors. Individually, none of these are new. But together, they create the same environment seen in earlier periods, where maintaining stability requires more active management of the cost of money itself. And once that begins, the gap between official numbers and real-world experience starts to widen. Inflation expectations move differently than policy statements. Asset prices adjust faster than wages. And confidence becomes harder to anchor. This is the part most people miss. Because systems don't feel unstable while they are changing. They feel normal. Right up until the moment they don't. And that is why history is useful here. Not because it predicts the future, but because it shows what tends to happen when similar conditions repeat. And if there's one consistent lesson across every case we've looked at, it is this. The impact is rarely immediate, but it is never evenly shared. And by the time most people notice it, it has already happened. Let's bring this back to the beginning. Because the question was never just about history. It was about trust. What happens when ordinary people do everything right? Follow every rule. Believe every promise. And still end up with less than they started with? Not because of fraud. Not because of failure. But because the system itself changed what their money meant. That is the thread running through every story you've seen. Different countries. Different decades. Same outcome. And it always starts the same way. A government needs funding. A system needs stability. A central bank steps in. And the cost of money is adjusted to maintain stability. At first, it feels temporary. Then it becomes normal. And by the time it becomes visible in everyday life, it is already deeply embedded. But there is something else in these stories that matters just as much. Because not everyone experienced them the same way. Some people held fixed promises, and lost purchasing power over time. Others held real assets, and preserved value. Some adjusted early, and protected themselves quietly. Most did not. Not because they were careless, but because the change was slow enough to ignore in real time. That is what makes these systems so difficult to see while they are happening. Nothing looks broken. Wages still arrive. Banks still function. Markets still open every day. But underneath that normality, the value of money is constantly being rebalanced. Not through one event. Through thousands of small adjustments over time. And history shows something consistent. By the time the effects become obvious in hindsight, the people most exposed to them usually had the least warning. Not because the information didn't exist, but because it was easy to assume nothing fundamental had changed. And that is where the real lesson sits. Not in fear. Not in prediction. But in awareness of how value actually moves inside a system that is always adapting. Because the system does not need to break to change outcomes. It only needs time. And most people only realize what happened long after it was already too late. Let's end today's video here. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical video, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss our upcoming videos. Your support means everything, so please, take a moment to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until we meet again in the next video. Take care and goodbye.